Good afternoon. Welcome. Welcome to this class full of people in person. Welcome to our folks online. Welcome to those of you who are part of the class and maybe just couldn't make it here today and are now watching the recording of this class online. And welcome also, as I've said each week, these past several weeks, welcome also to people who are joining us many months from now and who have come across this series of classes archived on our website. You also are very welcome. In fact, it was with you in mind that much of the renovation of this room and the new technology that we're using today, it was with you in mind that this room was constructed. So you may feel that you've just sort of stumbled into this class, but we had you in mind from the beginning. So you are very, very welcome. So we are now up to week 6, and this week's class topic is the early Christians and the church. So we've gone through the incarnation of Jesus. We've looked at Jesus' life and ministry, his death, the resurrection, and ascension. Last week, we dipped our toes into the very deep waters of Paul, St. Paul, and his theologizing, for that's what he did. He was a pastor, and so he ministered to people. He was an evangelist, and so he established Christian communities. He was a nurturer, because once he had left those communities, he kept in touch and wrote them edifying letters, some of which still survive, although some we know to be lost to time. And in all of that, he theologized, which is to say, he prayerfully and faithfully discerned the meaning of Jesus. The Gospels often tell us what Jesus did and where he went and who he interacted with. And Paul, never having met the incarnate Jesus, only having met the resurrected Jesus, Paul didn't have that particular story to tease meaning from. He teased meaning from the broader story: incarnation, death, and resurrection. As I said last week, Paul did a lot of reverse engineering. He started with Jesus' death and resurrection and worked backwards, finding meaning along the way. Now we turn to the early Christians and the church, and meaning the early church, the church of the apostles, the apostolic era. The church is established at Pentecost. The apostles, at least sans Judas, are still around. We're hearing the gospel straight from their mouths, a period before the gospels are written down, the period where scripture in the Christian sense was the Old Testament, the Hebrew scriptures, and the letters of Paul that had found their way here and there. This is the apostolic era of the church, before the church fathers, before the patristic era. This is the apostolic era where the apostles themselves are the teachers and leaders of the church. And that's what we're going to look at today, for that is the earliest era of the Christian movement, after the resurrection and ascension, and before the apostles went to their eternal glory and the church fathers became the leaders and guiders of the church. So enjoy this video. We're going to meet together on the other side of it. But I commend the video to you. We're once again in the company of Tom Wright, N.T. Wright, and Michael Bird. So enjoy the video, and I'll see you in a few minutes. Thank you.
The single most striking thing about early Christianity is its speed of growth. Jerusalem witnessed The single most striking thing about early Christianity is its speed of growth. Jerusalem witnessed.
I think he's trying to get full screen.
Yeah, I had it interrupted now a couple of times.
Yeah.
Well, I don't know why.
Thank God they can edit this before they post it.
The technology, it's a wonderful thing.
1, 2, 1, 2.
The single most striking thing about early Christianity is its speed of growth. Jerusalem witnessed Jesus' death, but within 25 years, Athens and Rome had heard of it too. The church spread like wildfire. But Christianity did not spread because it simply comprised a more inclusive brand of Judaism, replacing ritual with philosophy and offering a new introspective type of spirituality. The often risky and costly mission launched by the early church can only be explained in terms of the belief that the God of Israel had acted in Jesus to redeem Israel, and a redeemed Israel would transform the world. The consistent testimony of the New Testament is that Israel's Messiah had inaugurated the new covenant. And it was through this new covenant people that Abraham would be the father of many nations. Out of the death and resurrection of Israel's Messiah, God's never-failing love would reach out to the whole world.
As we begin to look at the early church, one of the first things anyone might notice is one of the main symbols for what they believed and who they are was baptism. There's so many debates about baptism. You know, who should be baptized, how to do it. What is baptism really about?
For the early church, baptism was focused originally on John's baptism. Jesus himself was baptized by John, and then Jesus' followers were baptizing as well at the start of his public career. And so that was the seed from which there grew the early church's practice of baptizing. But it actually goes back a long way further than that, because John himself was doing something that was full of Exodus symbolism of the people of Israel coming through the waters of the Red Sea, and then at the end of their years in the wilderness, coming through the River Jordan and into the Promised Land. So it wasn't just, well, John happened to do it, so we're going to do it as well. It was John was announcing that the kingdom of God was coming, which was like a new Exodus. And since Jesus chose Passover, the Exodus moment, to complete his own work and actually to go to his own death and then to be raised from the dead, baptism came both to symbolize the Exodus and hence the new Exodus, and also to symbolize the dying and rising of Jesus as the ultimate Passover moment. So you have to imagine the early Christians somehow putting all that together into a package and saying, that's what we are going to be part of. This is the event which now determines who we are. And this is the event which then looks forward to the time when ultimately God will make the new heavens and the new earth, which is like completing dramatically what was launched with the death and resurrection of Jesus. So baptism is something that the whole church did. Okay, individuals come forward for baptism, families come forward for baptism, but baptism is something the whole church does in order to say, this is who we are. We are the new Exodus people. We are the new creation people. We are the death and resurrection of Jesus people. And so as individuals and as a community, they are defined by those events and are marked out as radically different from both who they were before, because baptism in Paul's letter to the Romans, chapter 6, is about dying to the old life and coming alive in the new life. So it's about being different from who we were before and about being radically different from the world around. That was actually what baptism meant from very early on. It is still what baptism means to a great many Christians in the world today, for whom baptism is a dangerous thing. Those of us who are brought up in the West often think of it as just a little social ritual that you might go through. But actually, for most people in most periods of history, it really marks out who the people of Jesus Christ are from the rest of the world, which is both hugely exciting and hugely risky.
I'm here on the northern side of the Sea of Galilee. Tradition has it this is the spot where the risen Jesus appeared to the disciples while they were fishing on a boat. He called out to them. Eventually they recognized him. Peter jumps out of the boat, scurries along and gets to the shore, and he finds that Jesus has already made him breakfast. And when Jesus is talking to Peter, he asks him those three important questions. Simon, son of John, do you love me? He asks him that question 3 times, and then Peter answers, yes, Lord, you know I love you. And Jesus tells him, then feed my lambs. Peter was reinstated after his denials, and he was commissioned to be a leader of the church. But what type of organization was Peter commissioned to lead? I mean, what was the church? Was it Judaism 2.0? Was it a philosophy? Was it a club, an association? Was it a hero cult or an Oriental mystery cult? Exactly what was the church? What did it look like in the ancient world? One of the best ways to answer that question, I think, is to consider the way that Christians were seen by others. In fact, one pagan author by the name of Cachelius, he describes the Christians as an obscure society. Now, I think that's quite an apt description, because the Christians were a little bit obscure or a bit strange. On the one hand, they were no longer pagans. They did not identify with the Roman values, Roman and Greek religion. They had a lot of the symbols and story of Judaism. They believed in the one God. They believed in the Messiah. They believed in covenant and creation. And yet they believed this had all come to a climax in the Messiah. And they had received the Spirit. And they were the beneficiaries. They were the recipients of the promises of Israel. And they organized their lives around that belief, that hope, and that story. They would meet in places like a lavish home of a wealthy member, or even in a squalid apartment somewhere in Rome or Corinth. Or maybe they would meet in someone's workshop or on the shores of a river. And they would meet and they would do things like they would pray together. They would read scripture together. They would break bread and remember the Lord's death and resurrection. They would exercise their spiritual gifts. At the end of the day, they believed that they were the one on whom the end of ages had come. They had believed in Israel's Messiah. They had received the Spirit. They were a people of the word, of spirit and sacrament, believing that God had a plan for this world, and it was beginning with them, and it would come to fruition through them.
So when we think about the early Christians through the first 2 or 3 centuries of the Christian era, one of the questions that we have to address is, what made them distinctive? How did they think of themselves as different from people around? And how did people looking at them find them different? Because they certainly did. Perhaps the most striking thing is that they were monotheists, and they were monotheists of the Jewish type. There were, of course, plenty of non-Jewish, non-Christian monotheists, the Stoics, who believed that everything was divine and that the divine was in everything, were monotheists, believing in one God, because there is only one everything. And likewise, many people in the pagan world believed that actually behind the notional gods of Zeus and Poseidon and all the others, there was in fact one ultimate divine substance, but you could worship the different ones, and it didn't matter if you added a few extras here and there, or indeed if you worshipped an emperor or somebody else, some other human being. That was perfectly allowable. But for the Jews, there was one God who had made the world and who would put the world right at the end. And the Christians said, yes, and this God has revealed himself in and as Jesus of Nazareth, Israel's Messiah. And this meant that they were monotheists of a Jesus-centered type, and indeed a Holy Spirit-activated type, because when they talked about the Spirit, they talked about this one God as being with them and in them and inspiring them and breathing through them. So that's at the center of it. And they had to learn that and to pray that and to teach that. But they also believed in a single story. Many of the ancient pagans believed more or less that history was random. It was just stuff happening, going nowhere in particular, and you just did the best you could. Or, at least for the Stoics, it was a history that would go round and round in an enormous great circle, everything collapsing into fire and starting up again. But for the Christians, like the Jews, the world had a beginning and would one day have a climax, a conclusion, when the Creator God would sort out his creation once and for all. So belief in monotheism, belief in what we call in the trade eschatology, the fact that it's all going somewhere, and then belief that we are part of this because somehow what God has done in and through Jesus has caught us up in it, so that our personal stories are like little microcosms of that much longer story and become part of the ultimate divine purpose. And so monotheism, eschatology, with Jesus at the middle and the death and resurrection of Jesus as the fulcrum, the point around which world history and your history and mine, as it were, all revolve. Those were the things that made the Christians distinctive. And it's very interesting when we look at the letters of Paul and when we look at some of the early Christian writings out beyond the New Testament, the sort of things that they constantly emphasize, that the Christians are to be united. They came from every different tribe and nation. They came from different social classes, men, women, and children. They were all part of this single family. That's really hard to do, as those of us who've worked in churches in our own day know perfectly well. It was incredibly difficult in the early church's day, but they insisted that we are one family and that this is the sign to the watching world that something new has happened. There is, as it were, a new version of the human race that's been launched, and the church was determined to model it by modeling itself in the power of the Spirit on Jesus himself. One God, therefore, and one people, reformed and reshaped around Jesus. And along with the unity of the church, there went this astonishing thing which we can loosely call holiness, that there was a different way of behaving, a way which took God's world seriously, a way which took human bodies and human minds seriously, a way which others looked on at and said, we didn't know people could live like that. For instance, towards the end of the 2nd century AD, the great pagan doctor Galen wrote about the Christians. He called them the Nazarenes. He only knew 2 things about them, but they were very striking. One was that they believed in the resurrection of the body. The other was that they didn't sleep around. Galen thought they were mad on both counts. He didn't know anyone else who had those 2 particular things as part of their worldview. But these are signs and symbols that for the Christian, new creation, beginning with Jesus and going on towards the ultimate new creation, this is what made the Christians distinctive. It was difficult then, it is difficult today, but following Jesus means nothing less.
When you imagine the early church, you might picture Paul and his co-workers in some densely populated early environment, somewhere like Ephesus or Athens, Corinth, or maybe even Rome. That's all well and good, but we've got to remember there was also a church in Palestine, in Judea and Galilee, and that's not insignificant. In the case of the Jerusalem church, they went through a series of persecutions. We know from the book of Acts that there was a persecution in the early 40s where James, the son of Zebedee, was martyred for his faith. Then later, Josephus, the Jewish historian, tells us that James, the brother of Jesus, was also put to death sometime around 62 AD. According to tradition, the Jerusalem Christians fled Jerusalem on the eve of the Jewish revolt sometime around 66 AD, and they traveled north to Pella in the Transjordan, and they re-established themselves there, creating their own churches, like here in Kersey in the ruins we can see of an old church. Not only that, but many of them began to migrate further east, going places like Syria and Babylon and Persia. And by the early 2nd century, some had even gone as far as India. Now, if we think of a moment about these Jewish Christians in Judea, in Galilee, or in Syria, if we want to know what life was like for them, we get a very good picture of that from the Epistle of James. James, as we saw before, is written to a church in this sort of area. It's a rural church where they're very enmeshed in Jewish social life. In fact, they're still going to some sort of synagogue. We also know they're being exploited by wealthy landowners, and James makes several warnings towards them. He talks about those who have fattened their hearts in the days of slaughter. As a result, James doesn't want the churches there to imitate the kind of behavior where there's factionalism or favoritism, where people are looking up to the rich and looking down on the poor and the vulnerable. James also sees this church as having a very strong anticipation of what God's going to do in the future, how God is going to bring things together when Jesus comes back and puts all things to right. And that's what drives their prayers and their sense of endurance under hard times. And I think that's very important because it's how one lives that shows what one truly believes. And James wants this church, somewhere in the rustic environments of Galilee or Syria, to show their nature of their faith through their speech, through their piety, through their prayers, and all that sort of a thing. And that is why this is a church which he calls them to treasure the Torah and the teachings of Jesus. The two go together. What we see in the Epistle of James for these Jewish Christians is that they didn't have to leave their Jewishness behind. They are Jewish. They are faithful to that way of life. And they didn't have to leave it behind by being a follower of Jesus.
As we think about what it was like to be a Christian in the 1st century, what it was like to be part of this strange family that had come into being through the preaching of the gospel, one of the best examples for us to work with is the first letter of Paul to Corinth, because there he was over probably in Ephesus, and he's had messengers come from Corinth to say, okay, since you left us, we've had these problems and these questions and these issues come up. And Paul writes a letter, and when we look at it like an angled mirror, we get a sense of, oh, this was going on there, and that, and that. And we see a church determined from all sorts of points of view to be loyal to Jesus. This is an exciting new thing they've got, determined to live as Christians, and yet often very muddled about what that would actually mean. And we see them particularly navigating what it meant to be followers of Jesus within a basically pagan society with all its pressures and its problems. So in the first 4 chapters of 1 Corinthians, we see all sorts of problems about personality cults. Some people are saying, I'm Paul's man. Others are saying, well, I'm with Cephas, that is Peter. And some others are saying, oh, no, I'm the Messiah's man. Well, we're not quite sure whether that meant they were a third party or what. But there's division going on in the church. And that happens so easily again and again. But then particularly it happens because there are different pressures through styles of teaching. And Paul believes that actually there is a different sort of wisdom which is there in the gospel. And what the churches are often wanting to do is to look respectable before their pagan neighbors. Oh, we have teaching that goes like this, or we have a teacher who came to town and was somebody we would all really respect. And Paul knows that the gospel isn't that sort of thing. So when he's sorted that out and made it clear that we shouldn't have divisions like that within the Christian church, then he addresses some of the key moral problems. Should believers have lawsuits against one another? And what about sexual morality? How does all that work? And so we can see them wrestling with these very difficult questions, and Paul giving some pretty clear answers. And from there, he moves on to questions about marriage and family life in chapter 7. And again, the early church struggled with these issues. For instance, in Paul's day, if a woman was divorced or widowed, it was not only natural, sometimes it was mandatory that she would have to get married again. And Paul says, no, she is free to get married, but she doesn't have to. There is a sense of actually exploring the possibilities of new creation. We don't just have to do things like they always did in the old world. But then in chapters 8 through 10, we find Paul addressing one of the central questions. all the meat that was on offer for sale in the market in a town like Corinth here, or pretty well all the meat, would have been offered to an idol in sacrifice before it was then sold on in the market. What are Christians to do? Are they to say, we don't believe in idols, so we shouldn't touch the meat? And here Paul says, no, the principle is this. There is one God who made all things, and nothing is to be rejected if it's received with thanksgiving. This is a kind of robust monotheism, but it addresses this very specific issue which they're facing. And then as he goes on, we find questions about the Lord's Supper. And in fact, it's from Corinthians and only from Corinthians that we know that Paul's churches did regularly meet to break bread and drink wine together. That's a central feature which he interprets in the light of the death and resurrection of Jesus. And from there, he goes into all sorts of questions about worship, the use of spiritual gifts, and the way in which they are to be used in harmony and not in conflict one with another. And from there, we find that he goes to one of the biggest questions of all, one of the biggest intellectual but also theological questions of all. What is the resurrection? Did Jesus himself really rise from the dead, and will we really be raised bodily? And then in the last chapter, he deals with details. They're pretty important, though, details about money, details about people who are coming and going, and so on. So as Paul puts all that together, we see that the life of the early church was a matter of a struggle to be loyal to Jesus, with the world pulling you in these various different directions. But in and through it all, Paul is teaching them to think Christianly, so that whether he's with them or whether he's away from them, they learn to grow up and to work these things out, what it means to be loyal to Jesus in all these areas of church life, both before the watching world and within the hostile world.
We've been looking at the early church, and I think a great way to finish up would be to talk very briefly about their distinctive meal, the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist. I mean, what was this meal about? I mean, what do you get at that meal that you don't get from anywhere else?
Yeah, it's clear from what Paul says about this meal in 1 Corinthians chapters 10 and 11 that it was central to the life of his churches, and that it was also problematic for a number of reasons. Here in Corinth, it seems that when people came together, the rich people were going ahead and having their own potluck, which they brought with them, while the poor people had almost nothing to eat. And Paul says this will not do, because this meal is supposed to symbolize and enact the unity of the church. But why this meal? It's something to do with Passover, that it looks back because of the meal that Jesus celebrated when he was keeping that strange sort of Passover with his followers that we call the Last Supper. And Passover is to do with Exodus, it's to do with covenant renewal, it's to do with the reconstitution of the people of God. And so when the early Christians met and broke bread together, this was about Jesus, and it was about the new thing that God was doing through Jesus, as a result of which it had to be about the unity of the church. Otherwise, it wouldn't make any sense. And so, all because of some very local difficulties that they had here in Corinth, we can actually see both that the Lord's Supper was absolutely central to the early Pauline churches, and also that it was powerfully symbolic about the redeeming work of God in Christ, and the fact that this ought to bring the church together rather than divide it.
Now I'm getting some interesting feedback here. One, two, 1, 2. Okay, the volume was just a little too high.
Sorry.
1, 2, 1, 2. Okay. So welcome back. I'm just going to turn it down one little notch more. There we go. Welcome back. That one, well, every week I say that there was a lot in that. For those of you who have the study guide, it starts on page 101. If you like titles, it starts on page 99, but I'm going to start on page 101. We've spoken about this before. Oh, I should just pause before I go on. There's a few things I'm going to highlight, but if you've been looking at the study guide and you find some questions that you thought were particularly interesting, that particularly got to the heart of the matter, or a question that really made you think, and by question I mean in the section the group discussion, there's going to be time. I'll pause here and there and say, any questions on what we've been talking about, and would anyone like to direct us towards one of the sort of big questions in the study guide? I don't want you to feel shortchanged, those of you who had purchased the study guide. The first quotation in 101 kind of talks about something that I've mentioned in preaching before. I'm not quite sure it's come up in class before, where we have some time to tease out some implications of it. It's the quotation that says the risky and costly mission of the church. They also hinted at that. I think it was Bishop Wright who said that the way we Northerners, Westerners, modern folk encounter baptism is a kind of harmless splashing. You get a phone call and a parent or grandparent says, when can we get the kid done? They don't really do that, but that's the sort of cliche. There's a time in the life of the church when baptism really was a risky business. I mean, it meant that your life was going to be transformed. It meant leaving things behind. It meant relationships that were at risk, livelihoods that were at risk, in times of persecution, lives that were at risk. The risky and costly mission of the church can only be explained in terms of the belief that the God of Israel acted in Jesus to redeem Israel. And a redeemed Israel would transform the world. Israel's Messiah had inaugurated a new covenant, and through his death and resurrection, God's never-failing love would reach out to the whole world. So I'm going to pause there. I mean, do you think we've lost because faith is less risky than it once was? Do you think we've kind of thereby lost just how powerful and transformative the faith is, the implications of the faith, the sacrifice that's made to follow the faith? Is, well, Bonhoeffer, I mean, is grace cheap?
I'm afraid that in the minds of many people, baptism is nothing more, particularly when it's infant baptism, is nothing more than the presentation of a child to society.
Yeah.
I'd like to hear Herb and Pastor, both of you, address the question of whether baptism is a requirement for eternal life or whether it is a symbol of a family's faith.
Well, the easiest answer is somewhat, both and. Because baptism, I think, has always incorporated a whole bunch of things. It's never, I don't think it's ever been simply one thing. So, as the video points out, baptism is connected to Passover, to Exodus, to liberation from slavery, liberation in the Christian sense from slavery to sin and death. It's a coming into a new land. It's also historically been the drowning of someone's sin, and that coming up out of the water is akin to, hold on a second. That would have been dangerous to try and stop. It's also had that imagery of going into the waters of baptism so your sin is drowned in the waters. It's also had imagery of entering into the tomb with Jesus. To go under the water is to enter the tomb of Jesus, and to come out of the water is a rebirth like Jesus' resurrection. as soon as St. Augustine started to develop his doctrine of original sin, which is that everyone is born with the sin of Adam still in them, still stained by that original sin of Adam, then baptism becomes that washing away of the sin of Adam. That's the rebirth. You're born with the sin of Adam. In baptism, there's a rebirth because you are washing that away. But it's also an ancient rite of passage that the person was something before the rite of passage and is now something new after the rite of passage. It was, and then it developed into that declaration that the old Ken, the old Louise, the old Steve, the old Doug, the old Herb, they were gone now, and now there was a new person. It was also that baptism would be the equivalent of circumcision. That circumcision was what marked you out, in that case, physically, literally marked you out as being part of the nation, part of the people of Israel. And because you were marked as part of the people of Israel, the circumcision was a mark of the covenant, that you were part of God's people. And how do Christians, how did they become children of Abraham? And the answer was in their baptism, that in baptism you become the adopted children of God. I mean, we're all children of God in our humanity, but adopted into that family into which our Jewish sisters and brothers are born and then marked by circumcision, at least the men. Now you were going to be marked as a child of God and part of the church family by your baptism. So it's never been, I mean, that was me just rattling off what happened to be in my head. I'm sure there's another dozen meanings of baptism that are not newfangled, fresh ideas, but are part of what baptism has been since the earliest days of the church. It was always a rite of entry. So rites of entry always inspire the question that's kind of behind your question, Steve, which is, well, if you haven't gone through this rite of entry, are you really in the family? If you haven't gone through this rite of entry, do you really get benefits? Are any of the benefits yours, which would otherwise be accrued to you by that right of entry? And so the church has trodden carefully and said, we don't know about folks who are not baptized. What we do know is the promise that we've been given, which is that those who are baptized are part of the church, adopted children of God, that the old Adam has been washed away from them. And then on and on, all the stuff that I launched into this spiel feels like 45 minutes ago. Some very conservative folks from time to time have said, well, there is no salvation out with the church, and there is no salvation to the unbaptized. Well, I don't think we can say that. I know that the Church of Rome has a doctrine that says the moment you believe, the moment you desire to be baptized, you've accrued the benefits of baptism should something happen to you in intervening time. Pope Benedict, maybe 10, 15 years ago, in earlier days of his pontificate, had said there's no such thing as limbo, that the church does not teach limbo. Limbo meaning that nothingness into which unbaptized dead babies go. Benedict declared to a slightly confused church that the church had never believed that, despite the fact that most of the people in the church thereby scratched their heads and said, I'm pretty sure I've heard it before. Pretty sure we have been taught that. We always come back to that mercy of God that says, we proclaim what we know and we leave to the mercy of God that which we don't know. But we can't diminish the importance of baptism historically in the life of the church. Although there is a movement within multiple denominations that says you should not be required to be baptized to receive Holy Communion, that Holy Communion is almost that entry point because of that open table fellowship we have, that an inquiring soul who loves Jesus should be admitted to the table, and then baptism is spoken about. So very, very short question, very long answer, but I think it speaks to the centrality of the doctrine of baptism and the space that it's held in the life of the church. I mean, it's a big thing. But nowadays, I think people think of it as, well, the most profound thought is probably rite of passage. The most common thought is probably that's how a baby becomes a member of the church. And the most frivolous thought is, well, the grandparents want the baby to be done, so we'll get the baby done.
This can be a very real issue for some adults. I'm going back in time to a time before you became pastor of St. Armand's.
Mm-hmm.
I was teaching at that point, and we were focusing in upon baptism.
Mm-hmm.
And there is one of the adults who was in that class who is now deceased, who was very much concerned because he had no evidence of the fact that he had ever been baptized.
Yes.
And we therefore had to come to an agreement as to what to do. At the time, the pastor who was serving the church as interim was Mark Hilmer. I don't think any of you remember him. Mark was a former professor at Luther Seminary, professor of Old Testament. And when he no longer could teach because of years, he became an interim pastor, and his first charge was at St. Armand's.
Mm-hmm.
He and I and several other people had a long discussion about this. We don't usually baptize in any situation. We recognize baptism as being valid regardless of the denomination in which it is performed.
Mm-hmm.
However, in order to set to rest the mind of this particular individual, we crafted a quasi kind of and brought this individual to the altar rail, the baptismal font, baptized that individual with due prayers that God would forgive us if indeed we were doing something, repeating something that had previously been done.
Forgiveness is easier to find than permission. That's a great story, Herb. I've encountered it personally a number of times. And, you know, fools rush in where wise men never go. So I tend to rush in. What I do is ask the person if they would like to be baptized. And then I do a public, perfectly straightforward baptism. And it's a conditional baptism, which baptisms are not normally conditional. A sacrament is not conditional. A sacrament is a promise by God that grace will be encountered in this act. By conditional, what I mean is, if that person has never been baptized before, they are now. And if they have been baptized before, then what we did was simply it was a prayer service at which we enacted memories of baptism. You know, the conditional part of it is it the first time or the second time? And it's usually, I always make it clear to the congregation what's going on, because you're right, we don't rebaptize. I believe in one baptism, forgiveness of sins, the resurrection, as you know, the creed. I don't want anyone to ever doubt their baptism. And that's what happens when some of my colleagues, you know, I have to be careful with this story because this person is still in ministry, but they baptized someone again when that person's sibling was being baptized. And it was like, well, wouldn't it be nice to have them both baptized at the same time, even though the other one previously been baptized? Well, I come back to Luther, who was very strict on the sacraments in many respects, but it's not because of some feeling that it's bad juju to do this. But Luther would say, don't ever do anything as a pastor that makes someone doubt promises that have been made to them by God. And I think when we rebaptize people, it makes the congregation say, well, maybe my baptism didn't take, or maybe I need to be baptized again. And that attacks people's conscience, and that is something Luther always found unforgivable. So a conditional baptism. I've also baptized as many folks who've worked in hospitals in chaplaincy or during training in chaplaincy. The question has always been, do you baptize babies that died? And I have on numerous occasions, and most of the chaplains I know have. And again, that's conditional, and I don't say this to parents because that's not a moment to teach parents about sacramental theology. But my mind there is, if the soul is still in the child, if God wants to look kindly upon this and bestow upon that child the promises that are inherent in the sacraments, then God will. And if not, it's going to be because that child rests in the Lord at that moment and is far beyond the need of baptism. So I don't do any of those. I've never performed a baptism on a dead child with my fingers crossed and hidden behind my back. I've always done it very willingly, knowing that God has this. I don't, but God does. But it does speak to the power of baptismal theology.
Pastor Herbert said before that he suspects that sometimes this is done just as presentation of a child. But many years ago, and it's probably about 30 plus years ago, that was my brother.
Oh, hold on a second. Could you hear Louise?
No.
Thank you. I said I suspect that Pastor Herb's comment about, is this good?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. That about it being often just a presentation of a child may be correct. 30 plus years ago, my brother and I were asked to be godparents to a niece of ours, my sister's daughter, and we were Lutheran church, baptism, godparents and the whole thing. And then when I never really heard anything more about whether they were going to church because we lived 600 miles away. When she was 3, I said to my sister, "You're going to start taking her to Sunday school?" Oh, she says, "Nah, we don't really need to." But you made me make promises. And after pretty much a year of it, both my brother and I just gave up, to the point where now, if someone were to say to me, "Will you stand in as a godparent?" Unless I really, really knew the person, I thought I knew my sister, I would say, like, do you really have an intention? And it saddens me that that's a necessary question sometimes.
Yes. Yeah. And I have, you're the only one here, so feel free to keep it for the time being. Pro 10. Yeah. And that's always a concern of mine as pastor. I get beyond it or get over it by focusing on the child and God. But I hear you. It leaves a bad taste in the mouth. He's now former Episcopal bishop of the Diocese of Central Florida, was someone that I ran into many times. I'm not saying we were friends. He couldn't pick me out of a lineup, but I was around him more than I was around many Episcopal bishops. And he was a fine man. It was a very conservative diocese, and he was a very conservative Anglican. He got into a stissue over the baptism of the baby of a same-sex couple, and his views on same-sex couples and marriages was very conservative and very traditional. But he had declared that the baptism was about the child and not about the parents of the child. And that although his opinion on same-sex relationships, same-sex marriage was still as traditional as it ever was. In his diocese, he would not ever say that a baby or child could not be baptized because of the aforementioned, which led to him being ostracized by a number of conservative groups, and he had to resign from the board of a college, and it was beyond the pale for some of his colleagues. His teaching on that topic had never changed, but he was faced with a pastoral decision, which is he said was actually a little easier to make than you would make that decision than his friends might think, because he was focused solely on that child and the relationship between that child and God. Baptismal theology binds us in really powerful ways. And that's the quotation that actually is on page 106. That really gets to the heart of that. Dripping there it is, pun intended, with new Exodus theology. It's probably worth pointing out one more time before we leave the topic of baptism, perhaps, that what we don't often link in, and I certainly in my preaching and teaching haven't linked nearly often enough and nearly explicitly enough, is that connection between the wilderness, baptism, and Last Supper. We think of baptism and Last Supper in Lutheran theology connected only because they're the only two sacraments we have in Lutheranism. But they're actually connected, as Bishop Wright and his colleague pointed out. They're connected by more than that. It's not just the happenstance that the supper was instituted during the celebration of the Passover meal, but that new covenant, new beginnings, freedom from exile and slavery and bondage and death are all themes in both sacraments, and themes both in the Exodus, in John the Baptist's public ministry, in Jesus' own baptism, and then the Lord's Supper. And also that additional connection that we had last week. Was it last week or is it this week coming up? It's this week coming up, where no, it was last week, where the imagery of the Great Commission is go ye therefore unto all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and by teaching them all that I have commanded you. And that's why probably I should point out that in Lutheran practice, and Herb will perhaps testify to this more powerfully than I, Lutherans don't do private baptism. You don't say, hey, can we get our kid baptized after the 11 o'clock service? A practice that's common in other denominations. Sure, after worship's done and everyone's out the way, we'll do the baptism. No, in Lutheran theology, it's done as a public act of the church in the midst of worship, surrounded by the community, just as the Lord's Supper is. No private communion. It's celebrated and in the midst of the community, so that the whole community of God sees the gospel reenacted, enfleshed in the sacrament that's going on. I mean, if I say performance art, I don't mean that dismissively, and Lord knows you all know me well enough to know that I'm not saying it mere performance art. But the point of performance art is that the folks watching are brought into what's being enacted, and in Lutheran theology, the community of God gathered round the altar and the font are being reminded of the whole of the gospel of Jesus and all of the promises of the gospel of Jesus. And it's not in a sermon, it's being enacted. That's what I mean by performance. It's being performed in the midst of the people of God. So private communion in an emergency or for shut-ins, yeah, you betcha. Private baptism when it's an emergency, before I was ordained, I'd performed a couple of dozen baptisms. all in an emergency situation, but wherever practical and possible, in the midst of the assembly of the people of God.
Pastor,
yes,
picking up on Louisa's comment, I was thinking back to Kathy and I when we brought our two children into baptism. And it seemed to me that as parents or as the couple bringing that youngster, that baby forward, the primary obligation falls on their shoulder to make sure that child is brought up and trained and so forth. And the sponsors, in our case, all Christians, but not Lutherans, for either child, I sort of thought, yes, they have a responsibility, but the first one is to give me a kick in their shins. If I'm not, more likely my wife, actually, but if we're not fulfilling our obligation.
Yeah.
So I think, Louise, you should feel okay.
Yeah. Well, he was saying that the primary responsibility rests on the parents, secondarily to the godparents, but primarily to the parents. Yeah.
It's okay. No, Doug, it was I had your comment re-explained me because I couldn't hear you, but you're absolutely right. But when my sister, the parent, blew it off altogether, and frankly, my brother-in-law couldn't have cared less, whether their daughter was baptized or not. It was really kind of a surprise and a shock to me to realize that I had been hornswoggled or something. So sad.
Yeah. But the power of we've lost a wee bit in baptism. There's only a few fragments of the rite of exorcism left in baptism. Even in the Church of Rome, there's only fragments of the exorcism rite, and in Lutheranism, it's even fewer fragments. But I think we can sometimes over-focus on the responsibility of parents and godparents. The central act in baptism is God. God is acting. In both of our sacraments in the Lutheran Church, God is the active, the prime mover. We are the recipients, coming to the altar, coming to the font, as Luther would say, simply as beggars. We bring nothing except our brokenness. So there's really, Lutherans believe there's power in the sacraments, and that's not conditional upon the attitude of heart of our parents, godparents, or the person sitting next to us in the pew. We really do believe that powerful forces of God are at work in the sacraments. And really, if there was any way that what we did could get in the way, there wouldn't be a valid sacrament anywhere, anytime, either because of the brokenness of the clergy person, or the brokenness of the recipients. And so I still come back to Bishop Brewer in Central Florida Diocese, who knows his Anglican theology of what happens in baptism. And as he said, it's about God and that child. And that's true in Lutheranism too. And it's wonderful that we have parents and make that require promises to be made by them, and wonderful that we have sponsors and have require promises to be made by them. But that is always going to be secondary to what's happening through the power of God in the Holy Spirit, acting in and through bread and wine and water. And in that we are just beggars. I'm glad to say, because if it was down to me, it'd be an invalid sacrament.
May I make one further observation?
Oh, absolutely, Herb. Fire away.
And that is that in a practical sense, I think that we would be far more aware of the importance of baptism and what baptism means for us if we didn't hide the baptismal font on most occasions. It does me a great deal of faith building to see the baptismal font at the entrance to the church and the waters there, and the blessing of the baptism as we enter the church, remembering what our baptism means.
Yes, I've seen well, the church I grew up in had a baptistry, and so the congregation could barely see what was going on. It was a fantastic baptistry. It had murals on the wall that recited the Lord's Prayer, the Creed, and the Ten Commandments in gold leaf. It was lovely, and the font was 4 or 5 steps up to it, and it was carved from a single piece of stone, and the lid was carved from a second single piece of stone, and was so heavy that there was an intricate brass pulley system to raise and lower the lid, but you couldn't see the bloody thing from the church. So, unless you happen to be strategically positioned on the far right wing of the church, no pun intended, and then you had a good view of the font. There is a lot to be said about passing the font on the way into worship. Bishop Suarez, who is probably in the midst of an election right now, hopefully a re-election, Bishop Suarez, when he was consecrated as bishop, and I know this because I was the liturgical director for that installation, and we'd selected a church, St. Mark's Roman Catholic Church. Almost all of our bishops have been installed and consecrated in a Roman Catholic church in Florida, for reasons I can explain another time, good reasons. That font was enormous. Water flowed out of it. It was a huge brass font. Water flowed out of it continuously down the side into a small pool, which then flowed into a walk-in, walk-out pool that had toughened glass over the top of it so you could walk. It was part of the narthex, part of the beginning of the nave. But if that priest or that family wanted immersive baptism, those glass panels could be lifted up and you could walk into the baptismal font and out, and all of the water was fed from what we look at as a more traditional font. Powerful, wonderful, glorious. And you could not get into that space without passing the flowing waters of that font. So living waters, and you literally walked over the waters of baptism to get in the church. Okay.
The best modern example I can think of that is in St. Peter's Church in Manhattan, New York. Oh, yeah. Louise may be familiar with it. It's located in the City Court building. Upon the entrance to that sanctuary, there is a baptismal pool.
Mm. It is very powerful to be reminded of your baptism as you walk into church. In the Church of Rome, and in many Anglican churches, the closest we get is the little holy water dispenser where it's just big enough to get your fingers in, at least before COVID, and dip to get some holy water there in order to the sign of the cross, which itself, with the water and the sign of the cross, is a remembrance of baptism. But powerful. And I've been in so many Anglican and Catholic churches that I instinctively reach. You almost don't even have to see it. You just know it's there. And to get the water to make the sign of the cross. Okay, so we spent a fair bit on baptism, but it was central to the life of the early church. You prepared a whole year for your baptism. You came into the church, and when Holy Communion was celebrated, you were excused. You hadn't been baptized. You could only go so far in worship unbaptized. And then at Easter Vigil, the great night upon which in the early church so many people were baptized, you were baptized at the Easter Vigil so that you could take Holy Communion with the great assembly on Easter Sunday. But that has now been distilled down into a lot lighter way of approaching it. But it was so central to the theology and the life of the church. But wasn't it interesting to be reminded that 1 Corinthians reveals to us just how central the celebration of Holy Communion was to the life of the church? Mm-hmm. We have it in our heads, I think, a little anti-Catholic. A lot of Lutheranism is distinctly anti-Catholic. I don't know why. It would horrify Luther. We think of Holy Communion and the celebration of Holy Communion as, well, it must have been simpler and easier back then, and they probably just celebrated it once a year, whether you needed it or not. But we seem to see in 1 Corinthians, that the celebration of the Lord's Supper is central to the community coming together. And the didache, which is, and Herb, I'll need your help, I think a 2nd or 3rd century, maybe late 1st century, early 2nd century.
Second, I believe.
Yeah, manual on prayers and practice in the church, the didache. It has an incredibly complex Eucharistic prayer. We think, oh, we've complicated this so much over the years. You read it, that's where we get that hymn from, the Marty Haugen hymn. As the grains of wheat, once scattered on the hills, were gathered into one to become our bread, so may we be gathered from all the ends of earth, gathered into one in you. And Marty Haugen didn't write those words. That is a late 1st, early 2nd century Eucharistic prayer from the early church that was recited during the celebration of Holy Communion. So this desire for us to just have nothing but the verbal, let's just go straight into on the night in which he was betrayed. We don't need Eucharistic prayers. Well, the early church had complex, beautiful, profound Eucharistic prayers, of which that little sample from Marty Haugen is but one. They were waxing lyrical. The early church were waxing lyrical about the meaning of this bread. This bread was baked, and the wheat was gathered from all over the field. Now it's from that great crop has come down into this one loaf, just like us guys. We're gathered from everywhere, but now we're one in Christ. So, they weren't content with just the verba, with just the words of institution. The early church had beautiful, profound, poetic Eucharistic prayers. I'd love to know what was said around the equivalent of the altar, the communion table, with Paul celebrating and the Pauline community celebrating. But worship was central to the early life of the early church. I've talked a lot. Are there questions coming up that we haven't touched on that those of you at home or in person had thought, boy, I'm really looking forward to a discussion on this, and lo, we haven't had one? Shout out now.
This is Steve, and I have to depart in about 5 minutes for another commitment. So I'm not walking away. I'm just going on to the next chapter.
I hope that speaks for all of us.
Walgreens drugstore in Sarasota.
This is not the end. This isn't the end of the beginning. It's the beginning of the end. That ruined that Churchill quote. This isn't the end. It's not the beginning of the end. It's the end of the beginning.
Yeah.
I only have one comment
Yes.
to make about to talk about a section on page 101, and the question is, why is it easy to think the church is just a location where believers meet at a set time? I am known as a nitpicker. I try, don't laugh, I try to refer to this location here in this building as my congregation. And I'd like the word anyway, because it's the flock coming together, literally, the etymology. And the church, in my mind, is not St. Armand's Key Lutheran congregation or whatever you wish. But it is easy to think of the church as a location. And in my mind, this is not the church, capital C. It's not even the mothership that's the church. It's what we do when we leave the building. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm not entirely sure I agree with it, but it makes sense. Okay. The church has never been well, of course it has been a building. The church ought never to be a building. So the church is the congregation of St. Arman's Quay Lutheran Church. The church is not the property occupied by, owned by the congregation of St. Arman's Quay Lutheran Church. So the church, the very meaning of the word ecclesia, that was the coming together of the polis. That was it predates the Christian meaning. So the ecclesia in the Greco-Roman world were the people coming together in a deliberative, united fashion for the sake of the city, or for the sake of the republic, or for the sake of the province. That was the ecclesia. So in Christian terms, the ecclesia is the gathering of the people of God. Those of you who've listened to me or pretended to listen to me or endured listening to me these past 6 years will know that one of my shticks is the following: we gather together to scatter, to gather the scattered together. I've always liked that. I'll say that one more time slowly. We gather together to scatter, to gather the scattered together. That's what the church does, but what the church is. So it's the difference between what is the church and what does the church do. The church is, or the church are, or my proofreader can figure out the syntax for me for a modest fee, 10% raise. The church is the assembly of the people of God. What the church does is always then to scatter away from where they meet. And they don't always have the luxury of being in a large group where they can say, we are the church. Because it's tough to say, I am the church. It's always got to be, it's really, we are the church. But then what does the church do? The church always scatters, not to be church, but to be Christ to the world. So the Monday morning Christian has left the church, both the building and the assembly, and is now out doing what the church was called to do, which is individually in small groups, and more rarely as a committee of the whole, to live out the gospel, to share the gospel, in that most wonderful mission statement of all. Go ye therefore unto all the nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them all that I have commanded you. And lo, I shall be with you always, even to the end of the age, even to the end of the epoch, or whatever word you want. So that's the way I look at it. But when you say I'm going to church, if I'm in the parsonage and I need to get something out of the office, I say to Amy, I'm going to the office, because I'm not going to the church. I'll deactivate the alarm and it's only me in there. It's not the church. I go to church on a Sunday. I go to be church on a Sunday because we're all there. And it's you might think it's a distinction without a difference, or difference without a distinction. I never remember which way around that's meant to be. But no, it's important, because sometimes we have to figure out how much time, talent, and treasure do we spend on being the church, as opposed to keeping the building in which the church meets standing. And believe me, and you all know this, you know me better than most people around here, both you here and you folks online. I'm not one of those, oh, we don't need the buildings and we shouldn't spend money on things looking good. I far from that. You know me better than that. But I think theologically it's useful to make that distinction of when you're church and when you're not. Yeah.
There's an important distinction, which is also pointed out by the authors at the bottom of page 108. Why is it dangerous for Christians to be devoted to a pastor, leader, or even specific congregation? Very often we get to the point, unfortunately, where it's a case of we're not going to St. Paul's Church or St. Peter's Church, but we're going to Dr. So-and-so's church. I had that difficulty many times in ministry and had to correct people. You're not going to my church.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it reminds me of the old joke where the man has been trapped on a desert island for 20 years and finally he's rescued, much to his relief, great rejoicing. And the Coast Guard helicopter lifts up, having rescued the chap from the deserted island. And as the helicopter banks over the island, there's a few buildings there, and says to the guy, "What's that building there?" He says, "Oh, that's my hut. I lived there." "And what's that building there?" He says, "That's my church." He says, "And what's the other building over there?" He says, "Oh, that's the church I used to belong to." But that reveals the truth. Yeah, and you know, human beings become attached. I've got more experience of this in Scotland with the Church of Scotland than I do over here. Although working with a synod, it's going to become an increasingly common phenomena. But in Scotland, for weird historical reasons, because there were splits in the church and then unification in the church, you have Church of Scotland buildings all over the place, catty corner from each other, you know, 3 on a city block, you know, that kind of stuff. And there was, you know, the headquarters of the Church of Scotland is 121 George Street. And when 121 comes into town, they have the power to say, okay, that building's closing, that building's closing, that building's closing, and you're all going to merge with that one here. Well, you can imagine what happens. In an ideal world, everyone would go, yeah, that way we can all survive and we can be the church in that building. But the reality is, no, my grandfather was baptized here. My great-grandfather was married at that altar or that communion table. We are attached to buildings. Our hearts are attached to buildings. And sometimes our hearts get attached to pastors. And sometimes our hearts get attached to synods or a diocese. And, you know, so your point is well made and well taken, Herb. But boy, sometimes when that's lost, it feels like part of your heart's been torn out. And, you know, you folks, in my most of my experience of Lutheranism has been in upstate New York and down here. And, you know, the Lutherans don't have the big churches. We have the smaller, built in the 50s churches. But you folks probably all grew up north in historic stone churches. And, you know, they mean a lot to us. They're part of our heart. And when one of them gets closed and sold or burns down, or, you know, it's part of our heart is ripped out. It's tough. I never, and I know you weren't either, Herb. You know, I never minimized the pain of that. It's real.
The congregation in which I was baptized and grew up to some extent had gone through many changes since my mom left the area, whatever. It was no longer Lutheran Church of the Messiah. It was the Park Church because it was right across the street from the park. And apparently the synod was just tossing money in there to keep it open. And it was just recently closed with protests from the community. And my brothers and sisters and we all talked about it and said, you know, and some of them are still part of Metro New York Synod, but they said, are you going to write a letter of protest? I said, it apparently had lived its life. It was no longer serving a dwindling Lutheran community. Well, it was never a Lutheran community. It was basically Roman Catholic, but and I said, no, I won't. You know, if it's gone, it had been founded as a mission congregation by the Reverend Samuel Trexler, and this was like a big deal, you know. But said no, and so it's gone. Yeah.
That's why I know under Bishop Suarez and certainly under Bishop Schaefer, there is the policy of the synod is that a church never simply quietly closes. That the bishop, most often the bishop, if the bishop really can't be there, one of his assistants, so that there can be a rite of holy closure, so that that congregation can celebrate what it once did, and all of the lives it touched and the difference it made in the community, and can give thanks to that, and to say that it's not that that's no longer required, but that this assembly of the people of God can no longer see that mission performed. And there's sadness in it, you betcha. There's tears in it, you betcha. But nobody is going. This synod doesn't allow a congregation to just fizzle and disappear. There's a celebration of all that it achieved, and I remember one church where the one congregation where that was near me, not here but elsewhere, where they were told in no uncertain terms, "You're not closing that day. You're ending the next week because the bishop and 2 assistants and the dean are going to be there, and they're going to celebrate with you." And sure enough, they all the aforementioned arrived and celebrated all that had been accomplished there. We have just a few more minutes. Any other questions that came up that you are very disappointed we didn't address? I was struck then hearing crickets. I was struck on page 111. This is part of our Christian theology that we tread carefully on, but it's not anything new to us. The early Christians believed that they were the beneficiaries, the recipients of the promises of Israel, and I believe that to be true. I don't pay that lip service. I absolutely believe that to be true. One has to be very careful how one says it, because the people of Israel at the moment are, passport carrying citizens of Israel, and in the remaining diaspora, folks whose theology teaches them that they are Israel. And I think Christians have to be very careful to say, because the implication, if you don't tread carefully, the implication is to say, we're actually better Jews than you are, or we're the fulfillment of Judaism. Well, you might not mean that means you're a second class, but the implication is if I'm part of the fulfillment of Israel and you're not part of me, then you're not fulfilled. If this is the climax of the promises of God made to Israel, but you don't possess those promises, you see what I mean? I say again, I believe this theology, but when we talk in the presence of our Jewish sisters and brothers, I think we have to be careful. And that's happened at this congregation within living memory of issues over things that have been said that sound very Christian, and are very Christian, but in the ears of a Jewish sister or brother who might love Jesus, but then hear in what's said something that's very insulting to the remainder of their family. That's and there's nothing politically correct about that. That's relational. That's how do we relate to the people of God who are our Jewish sisters and brothers, while not asking them to water down their theology, and we don't water down ours either. And I do probably, and this is probably a good words to conclude, at the very bottom of page 111, for the early believers, this was an exciting new thing that they had received. and they were determined to live as Christians while still getting muddled at times about what that actually meant. If I was ever to get a tattoo on my arm, I think I could do worse than the tattoo to read, I was determined to live as a Christian while still getting muddled at times about what that actually means. I think that kind of describes us all. We're nothing if not a work in progress. I thank you all. Next week, God willing, and the creek don't rise, we'll meet for session 7, the mission of the church, which begins in your books on page 119. But I remind you that if you have the study guide, on page 113, 113, there's the between the sessions personal study that reflects you, allows you an opportunity to reflect a little on your preparation for this week, the video this week, the discussion of the video this week. It's a nice segue into next week to just give you a chance, one last chance to reflect on what happens in a particular session, a between sessions personal study, before next week we gather for session 7, the mission of the church. So go in peace to love and serve the Lord. Thanks be to God.
God.